I'm Barbara Fork from the Department of Physical Education. And on behalf of the lecture committee, it's my privilege to introduce to you tonight Peter Grunstein, a man who used to spend his time pestering the Pentagon in Washington, but now has turned his attention to the owners of Major League sports. He contends that at least the Defense Department is accountable to the public and representatives, while the Major League team owners are accountable to no one. Peter is an investigative reporter and an attorney. He was a top congressional aide and served from 1973 until 1976 as bureau chief of the Capitol Hill News Service, where he specialized in uncovering stories of the Pentagon waste. This news service originated with Peter and Ralph Nader, and it was Nader who provided the money, the seed money, for the formation of FANS, an acronym for Fight to Advance the Nation's Sports. Peter is the executive director of FANS. The need for this organization stemmed from the beliefs of Peter that we're in the Stone Age of consumerism in sports. And he says that there's little recognition of fans as consumers and little understanding of the business of sports or the sheer size of it. He believes that at least 100 million sport fans are being ripped off and that something should be done about it. Peter is a native of Great Neck, New York, a graduate of Beloit College in Wisconsin, and George Washington University, where he earned his Juris Doctorate. He is well qualified to pursue his cause, and we're ready to hear him. And he's going to talk to us on the subject tonight of fans. Peter?
Thank you. A couple of years ago, was a Denver Bronco fan who shot himself through the head and left as his suicide note, I just couldn't stand the Broncos fumbling anymore. Last year, when on the day that Henry Aaron set his record of 715 home runs, a cab driver in Miami who wanted to watch the game but was forced out of the house to work by his wife committed suicide. A couple years ago at Ohio State University, a survey of the incoming freshmen found that 50% didn't know the name of the president of the university, but only one co-ed didn't know who Woody Hayes was. A French philosopher has remarked that to understand the heart and mind of America, you must know baseball. Another philosopher has said that sports mirror the true quality of a society. Bertrand Russell has remarked that to be able to fill leisure time intelligently is the last product of civilization. Vince Lombardi has said, sports is life. George Allen, every time you win, you're reborn. Every time you lose, you die a little. And an NFL executive defining the word fan said, a fan is an individual who is very marketable. So the topic tonight is fans, and you can't really talk about fans unless, obviously, you talk about spectator sports, and only slightly less obviously unless you talk about participant sports. So let's start with the question, what are the positive qualities of sports? And let's start with the negative part of that question. of what I think is not one of the qualities that sports engenders necessarily any more than any other human activity. And that's what is usually referred to under some designations such as character building or moral turpitude or social cooperation or whatever. In fact, judging by the conduct of the modern professional athlete, I think one could make a reasonable argument that sports retards the onset of maturity. It doesn't promote it. And as Bruce Kidd, the Olympic athlete, has remarked, we should stop preaching about sports' moral values. Sport, after all, isn't Lent. It's a pleasure of the flesh. But to say that sports does not necessarily have any overriding spiritual or moral characteristics any more than any other human endeavor might have is not to deny that it has some redeeming values. And I think two of those values are so obvious that perhaps we forget them very frequently. One is, it's fun. Talking here about both spectator and participant sports. And the second is that there is a physical benefit, physical fitness, that can be derived from, certainly from participant sports. Now, I think on the one hand, we overemphasize sports, but underemphasize sport. Sports here being defined as competition, and sport here being defined as fun. And that many people, unfortunately, I think have a hard time accepting sport for its most obviously redeeming social characteristic, that it's fun, because they don't consider fun a serious enough purpose. Yet, in fact, it's enshrined in the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of fun, or happiness, which amounts to about the same thing. In other words, fun can be a serious business. And we should recognize that it is a primary societal value. And that because something is fun, as opposed to being a necessity of life, food, shelter, and clothing, whatever, does not mean that it has inherently less value to it. And that we don't necessarily have to seek fictitious justifications for this particular activity. So on this one aspect of the qualities of sport, participant and spectator sports really are not only closely correlated, they're identical. People choose to spectate, choose to participate in sports basically for that same reason, that they're fun. They're different, they may be different kinds of fun, but they're both fun. But what are the other quality? Physical fitness. I think that first thing that can be said is that while on this question they appear to be in conflict. Clearly, you don't become physically fit sitting in front of the tube on a Sunday, on a beautiful fall afternoon on a Sunday, with your pot belly, munching potato chips and guzzling beer and watching your favorite NFL team. And in fact, the conventional wisdom is that there is a negative correlation between spectator and participant sports, that in fact this barrel-bellied, beer-guzzling fan sitting in front of the tuber at the ball game isn't out on a Sunday afternoon playing touch football or tennis with his kids. It certainly has some superficial appeal, the whole notion of that. And when we think, if I were to ask you now to conjure up in your own mind the image of the fan, I have a feeling that most of us would conjure up almost precisely that kind of image. the American sports fan is pictured as sort of out of shape and slothful and the whole bit. But in fact, I think that may be pure myth, and that there is a much more positive relationship between spectatorship and participation in sports. Let me throw out a few possibilities. Think of the hokiest sports event you watched on television within the last 10 years. The most contrived, most commercialized event, other than the trash sports. What I'm talking about here is a real sport. Well, I think if you thought long enough about it, you might agree with me that it was the Billie Jean King-Bobby Riggs match. Yet, I don't know of any single sports event which had such a dramatic or obvious effect of creating participation. I know that I played tennis on public courts until shortly after that match, when the courts were so besieged with new tennis players, particularly women, that I spent more time. First of all, I couldn't get on the court, and then when I did, I'd spend more time chasing other people's bad shots than my own, and finally was driven into a private club. And that impact was measured quite clearly and dramatically all across the country. And the modern tennis boom started before that match, but there's no question it was fantastically accelerated as a result of that. And in all respects, in terms of tennis gear and the clothes and the tennis publications for women in particular, television and so forth. So here was an instance of clearly a very hokey, contrived event, very commercialized, resulting in literally millions of people taking up participation in a game that they had never before probably even contemplated. Another example, I think we owe a great deal to Roone Arledge, who's the executive producer for sports for ABC, as well as the chief of news for the network now. And I don't think Roone Arledge has probably ever consciously made a decision in the public interest, but some of his decisions have worked out to be in the public interest, including the one in which he decided to take a big gamble and extensively televise the marathon in the last Olympics, which, as you may know, Frank Shorter won. It was a dramatic race. It was watched by tens of millions of Americans, and it very clearly resulted in a tremendous acceleration to the running boom. So perhaps we as adults even are tremendously influenced to participate in sports by what we see on television. Perhaps by watching, that does not mean that when we watch a football game we go out and play football necessarily, but it does mean we can be influenced. And if we were influenced, what about the influence of kids? How many kids run out and play football during halftime of a game they're watching on television and are influenced to take up a sport that they initially see on television? But the effect can be the opposite, too. What about a university that spends $3 million on intercollegiate athletics for in which several hundred student athletes participate, and only $75,000 for 12,000 students to participate in intramurals? Okay, let's go back to the fun aspect of this. The one area that both spectator and participant sports clearly have in common. an essential ingredient for fun is access. You can't play tennis if you don't have a tennis court, and you can't go to a baseball game or football game without a ticket, or at least a television. Which brings us to the business of sports. And what I want to do now is go through some salient facts about the business of sports and how this affects the access of the average person to watching, to spectating in sports. Okay, fact number one is that sports are a monopoly, professional sports. All the sports have been the beneficiaries of blanket antitrust exemptions, either legislated or given by the courts. There have been antitrust exemptions for specific mergers of leagues, such as the NFL and AFL merger back in 1960. There is an antitrust exemption that affects the broadcasting rights, which is legally esoteric, but basically has meant literally hundreds of millions of dollars in additional revenues to the teams and the leagues. As one economist has put it, the truth is, you don't even have to run a team like a business to make money. With monopoly rights, even if you're inept, you're going to make money. And in fact, the data, and there's a considerable body of it today, indicates precisely that. Second salient aspect is that unlike any other monopoly you can name in the country today, this is professional sports is an unregulated monopoly. It is a self-regulating monopoly. It has been granted antitrust exemptions, but unlike monopolies such as the phone company and other utilities, there has been no governmental regulatory authority put over it to define and regulate its activities. Third salient fact is that it is a very heavily publicly subsidized industry. In relation to its revenues, perhaps the most heavily taxpayer subsidized business in the country today. Its places of business, stadiums, are built with taxpayer funds in the majority of cases. 26 of the 28 NFL stadiums are publicly financed. Of all professional sports facilities, 70% of them are publicly financed at a total initial construction cost of $837 million, whose total costs, including the debt payments through the 21st century, will equal $6 billion. That's for starters. Sports is the only industry in the country which has the right to depreciate for tax purposes human beings. As Bill Veeck, the owner of the Chicago White Sox, once said, in fact in one of his books called The Hustler's Handbook, we play the Star-Spangled Banner before every game. You want us to pay taxes too? They've been the beneficiary indirectly of the ticket tax deduction, which allows businesses which purchase tickets to write them off, while the average fan has to, of course, bear the full cost of the ticket. The effect on the owner of this policy is that it encourages him to increase ticket prices, since he knows that a large percentage of those tickets are being subsidized, the purchase of those tickets are being subsidized by the government. And as we mentioned, of course, there are antitrust exemptions, which have been worth literally billions of dollars in revenues to the various professional sports leagues. the next logical point to make is that with these antitrust exemptions, with the lack of any kind of governmental regulation, that with very heavy public subsidies, the teams, not surprisingly, in the middle of a phenomenal sports boom in this country, are making money. Apparently, that's too much for some people to accept, and indeed, the owners for the last 50 years or more have been perpetuating one of the most successful myths in American business, that they are on the verge of destruction, which, while never true, is less true today than it ever was in the past for a number of reasons. We'll go through just a few numbers here to prove this important point. The NFL has 28 teams. None of them will lose money this year. I can predict that with absolute assurance of its truth because they can't lose money this year. You could try to drive the team into a loss position, and assuming that you were using acceptable accounting methods, you couldn't, because you literally don't need a fan in the stadium as an NFL owner this year to break even. Under the contracts that were negotiated last year by Pete Rozelle for the entire league, as a direct result, by the way, of this 1960 broadcast antitrust exemption. And before 1960, the teams bargained individually with networks and stations for the rights to their games. There's a great deal more competition for those rights, which tended to keep the prices for them down, since networks and the stations could play off one team against another. As a result of the contracts, the 4-year contracts he negotiated, he received from the 3 networks a total of $656 million over a 4-year period, beginning this year, which works out to $5.8 million per team per year. The average player payroll in the NFL is $3 million, which means, obviously, before a single football has been kicked off, before a fan has parked a car or bought a hot dog or a single ticket, they've accounted for their largest single cost component and have $2.8 million in the bank. Well, we've done the economics on this, and they aren't very difficult, by the way, and the average team this year, and this is a very conservative estimate, in the NFL will earn $3.93 million, and in fact, if your team didn't draw a single fan into the stadium, assuming that on the road it played to average stadiums, you would break even. The Cincinnati Reds, who have raised ticket prices twice in the last 3 years and have among the highest prices in all of baseball, and who have also drawn 2.5 million fans or more for the last 3 years, earned $6.7 million conservatively last year. Los Angeles Dodgers, God knows, but a great deal more even than the Cincinnati Reds. Charlie Finley, with his entire disastrous administration of the Oakland Athletics, having alienated an entire city, every man, woman, and child, will make money this year on the Oakland Athletics, which frankly took me a little while to absorb. But in fact, the Associated Press did a very good study, and Finley admitted it, that he had been able to cut costs so much that even though he only drew 500,000 people, he made money. And if you can make money under those circumstances, you can literally make money in sports under any circumstances. The teams, and in addition to these aspects of it, their tax breaks, which were not computed in the basic profit and loss, the player depreciation provision, for example, where an owner can depreciate the players over a 5-year period, means basically that you can, in many cases, he can save $1 million or more in taxes through these artificial losses. That's in addition to these basic hardcore profits. Okay, the biggest myth, the one that you will be most surprised with, I'm sure, and challenge me on most, I would think, is that there is absolutely no correlation, except in rare instances, between ticket prices and player salaries. That the teams with the highest player payrolls are the teams with the highest ticket prices. But I just contradicted myself. But the teams with the highest player payrolls are the teams with the highest ticket prices are the teams with the greatest profits. And although there is a correlation between ticket prices and player payrolls, it's coincidental. It's not causative. And this is how it works. The reason teams... Okay, let me start by putting you in an owner's place. We'll take Walter O'Malley, who's president of the Los Angeles Dodgers, who are perennially the most profitable team in all of baseball, and perhaps the most profitable team in all of sports. O'Malley's presently, by the way, negotiating with United Airlines for the sale of the Dodgers so that he can avoid inheritance taxes, and the figure that's been thrown out for purchase price is $50 million. Walter O'Malley has one of the highest player payrolls in baseball. But as many of you are aware, the Dodgers draw a lot of people. This year, I think, what are they up to now? 3.3 million this year. Last year it was just slightly under 3 million. I think it was 2.96. Those people, let's assume, and it's right, that the average fan spends about $5 at the ballpark. It's a little low, but it's with parking and concessions, it's a little bit more than that, but let's say $5. That means that Walter O'Malley's taking in, without talking about local TV and network TV and radio rights, he's taking in $15 million in revenues. Well, his payroll, I can tell you exactly, we have all of the payrolls for the teams, but I believe it's about $2.8 million, let's say $3 million. So that's 1/5 of his revenues. Okay, the average player payroll in baseball is about $2 million. Now, O'Malley knows this. He knows he's obviously in a very good market for baseball. And he knows that his attendance varies from about 1.5 million when he produces a mediocre or lousy team to 3 million in that neighborhood when he produces a good team in a tight pennant race. So he's got 1.5 million variable there in terms of attendance. Multiplied by 5, that's $7.5 million variable. Now, he knows if he produces a good team, a competitive team, is one that wins, is a 600 team. It's a team that wins 60% of the time, I think, which is almost exactly what the Dodgers are doing now. Now, if he invests, the average player payroll is $2 million. If he invests an extra $1 million, 50% more than the average team, he knows, assuming he's not dumb and he makes the right decisions, he'll produce a better than average team, clearly. So he knows for that extra $1 million, he's getting somewhere in the neighborhood of an extra 1.5 million fans, times 5, $7.5 million. That's a return on investment, marginal investment here, of 7.5 to 1. $1 million producing an additional $7.5 million. So that takes care of the correlation between payroll and profits. Obviously, it makes sense for Walter O'Malley to spend an extra $1 million or an extra $2 million or an extra $3 million to get that 60% winning team, which is going to draw in those marginal 1.5 million fans and marginal $7.5 million worth of income. And if he doesn't spend that extra $1 million or $2 million if it takes that, or $3 million if it takes that, he's crazy. He's not acting in his own profit interests. Well, then why? Okay, but what about the correlation between ticket prices and payroll? Why is that correlated? Well, the reason for that is, as I said before, it's coincidental. Walter O'Malley, in setting his ticket prices, isn't thinking at all about player costs, because as we just showed, the only reason he's thinking about player costs at all is in maximizing revenue. He's already decided for himself that it makes sense to spend more than the average team so that he can produce a better than average club, which will bring in those additional fans, which will produce the additional revenue. It's a good investment. So he's already set his, I'm not saying he's not going through this quite this way, but this is basically what's going through his mind. I mean, he's already established he's going to pay a lot to produce a good team. He can afford to. Now he figures, okay, well, I've got a good team. I'm drawing in, a lot of fans. What do I charge? Well, basically the criterion is very easy. I charge whatever will bring in the most money. Revenue maximization is what the economists call it. If I charge $1, I might increase the number of fans that come in by 500,000, so I'll get 3.5 million. But that's silly because, all that'll do is sell out the stadium every game, and that's 3.5 million is not what I want. Suppose I charge $8. Well, that might reduce it to less than 2 million, and that would be less than what I'm getting now. You see what the process he's going through. It's if he's going through a profit maximizing process, and most owners do. Ticket price, okay? But you say, what's wrong with that? Isn't that just good business? Well, yeah, it is good business in this very insulated, unique, unregulated monopoly atmosphere. But now you're the owner of a hamburger stand. And let's assume you've got a monopoly hamburger stand, okay? Now let's start off with you've got a competitive hamburger stand. And there's a McDonald's down the block and a whole bunch of other ones nearby, and you're setting your price on hamburgers. Well, the thing that keeps coming across your mind is, I've got competition down the street. They're selling their hamburgers for 70 cents. So if I raise mine to 75, I'm going to lose X percentage to McDonald's. Okay? And that acts as a constant constraint on how much you're going to charge for your hamburgers. Now make believe that the city of Ames grants you a monopoly franchise on hamburgers in the city, and only you can sell hamburgers. Okay, what do you do now? Well, unless you're a really good guy, you start thinking to yourself, there ain't no McDonald's. It's just me and all those hamburger eaters out there. The question now becomes, what are they willing to pay for a hamburger? $1? If I charge $1, will I maximize my revenues there? Clearly, you forgot about 70 cents a long time ago. $2? At what point will I maximize my profits? Sure, they can, if you set them too high, theoretically, no one will come, we can all eat hot dogs or some other kind of food, but nonetheless, there are a lot of hamburger eaters out there. And so you fool around with your price until you're satisfied. You found the level that maximizes your revenue and your profits, which is exactly the process that a professional sports team owner goes through. It's not illegal, by the way, and it's not necessarily immoral. I don't think it's immoral under the circumstances. I'm sure I'd do the same thing if I had the opportunity. But it is the result of a system that is rather strange. It is not free enterprise, folks. There is nothing in this system as it applies to professional sports, if you're a true conservative, you should be appalled by what's happening here. And if you're a liberal, you should be equally appalled, because it's a hybrid. It's a hybrid that works, that is tremendously skewered against the consumer, the fan, against the taxpayer, and against the consumer who is not a fan. And perhaps later, when we get into questions and answers, we can go into how the consumer who, I'm not talking about taxpayer now, but the consumer who's not a fan is paying through the nose for at least one of the antitrust exemptions. By the way, one other just little sidelight, when you look at the teams with the team with the highest ticket price in the NFL is the Seattle Seahawks, an expansion team with one of the lowest player payrolls. And the reason for that is simply because it's a new expansion team. The demand was very high, so they set ticket prices high. Obviously had nothing at all to do with their player salaries. Okay, I'd like to talk for a moment about another, perhaps more disturbing phenomenon in sports, which is what I call the professionalization of amateur sports. Okay, and what is the professionalization of collegiate or amateur sports? It's, for one thing, most obviously, ticket prices, $8 ticket prices that approximate professional prices. It's ticket policies that are exclusively or near exclusively season ticket only policies that in effect bar the average fan who can't afford to buy season tickets from a stadium that his tax money in many cases helped build, when they're not built with donations. It's an alumni that defines their pride in the university not by the quality of the educational process, but by the one-loss record of the football team. It's athletes who can go through 4 years at an institution without getting an education in anything other than the sport they're playing. It's when $3 million is spent on athletics for a relative handful of students. By the way, don't assume that all of this applies here. It's just sort of, if the shoe fits. When a pittance is reserved for the thousands of students to participate in intramural athletics. What is happening, it's very difficult to talk about what's happening in colleges to athletics, because when I'm asked the question, well, what do you do about it, we are so far removed from being able to do anything about it. There's so little recognition even of what's happening and that there's anything particularly wrong about it. The situation is so bad. The public awareness, the awareness on the part of the students. I mean, I don't know of any institution in this country in which the student, there must be some, but I'm not aware of them, where the students are making an issue out of their own, what's happening at their own institution in terms of athletics. You hear lots of sort of plaintive complaints about the NCAA, but here's an organization that if it tried probably couldn't do more to destroy the amateur ideal than it has, whose single and most obvious motivation to every observer is monetary, whose every step taken in the last 15 or 20 years has been in the wrong direction, with the most minor and really insignificant exceptions. But there's no recognition of it. There's no discussion of it, not even within the academic communities themselves. So where do you begin? I don't know. I'm just amazed that there's so little discussion about what's happening at institutions concerning athletic programs. I want to open this up for questions very soon. I don't want to take up too much time. But the fact that it might help to be reminded that while, and I don't want to paint, first of all, I'm not that old, obviously, and I don't go back very far, but from what I've read and know, there really was some difference in the old days in college with the basic approach to sports, and occasionally I guess it might help to be reminded of it. And I wanted to talk a bit about Jack Trice Stadium. And I came across an article today in the Iowa State Daily from 1974. I thought might be worth reading a part of to you. It's really it's just an interview with William Thompson of Omaha, who is the only surviving member of the coaching staff of Iowa State in 1923. And he's talking about the proposal to name the stadium after Jack Trice. And Mr. Thompson says, quoting him now, "This proposal puts a kind of spiritual thought on the naming of a stadium. What's a stadium for? If the game has any educational value, if the game means anything to the man who's playing it or the man who's watching it, it should mean something in terms of courage and the spirit of enterprise, self-sacrifice, and in giving of oneself. Now, all these things are embodied in the legend of Jack Trice. And I didn't think there was anybody over at Iowa State who had the imagination or the understanding of what the game was about to even think of that. When I saw it in the paper, I was really very pleasantly surprised. You see, in those days, the game was played more for the sake of the game. We couldn't promise a guy anything except an education. The game meant something more than money and victory. That's why the naming of that stadium after Jack appealed to me, because they'd be naming it after a spirit that was illustrated in one game, and it's kind of a touchstone. The issue is simple, the spiritual part of the game. If you name it after someone who gives a lot of money, he was not the boy who was down there in the heat of battle. This Jack Trice thing is like holding a light, like carrying a torch. And if athletics means anything, that should be it. I think it would be great if Iowa State had the vision to put that light on the stadium." Well, I was going to close with a quote about if sports could consume more time, mass time in our society than sex, then it couldn't be all bad. But I think really this is a more fitting way to close. And one of the things that strikes me about this, and I admittedly obviously just have heard just a few things about this whole issue, but I guess one of the ironies that hit me about the naming of the stadium is probably the silliness of the whole issue. I mean, if the students want to name it Jack Trice Stadium, why don't you just name it? Whose permission do you need? I mean, if you want to make a point about what the stadium stands for, call it whatever you want. Put up your own sign. Give it your own name. Why not? Why can't the students take hold of the whole spirit of what should be something that in their lives that's healthy and fun? Why do they have to get the Board of Regents' permission to do something which they believe they can do for themselves? Thank you. Okay, I'd be happy to answer any questions. And anyone also feel free to leave. Don't feel that you have to wait around.